Betty Cash is driving down a dark road outside Dayton, Texas, through a stretch of East Texas woods where pine trees crowd the pavement, and the only light comes from her headlights reaching into the forest. Vickie Landrum is in the passenger seat. Vickie's 7-year-old grandson Colby is in the back. The three of them are heading home after being out that evening, following the narrow road through the trees. Then, coming around a bend, Betty sees a bright light ahead. At first, it looks like some kind of aircraft beyond the woods. But as they get closer, the lights keep flashing through the branches, growing brighter until the source finally comes into view above the road. Something enormous is hovering over the pavement. It's hanging low in the air, burning with a deep orange glow that washes across the asphalt and the trees. Flames are bursting downward in violent pulses from underneath. Almost right away, the heat starts building inside the car. Within seconds, it gets so hot that the metal roof above them begins to pop and crack. Betty stops the car and steps out. The heat hits her immediately as she looks up at the object overhead, pressing into her face and chest. Then another burst of flames drops from the bottom of the craft, and out beyond the trees, a new sound starts to rise. At first, it's faint, just a low thumping somewhere in the distance. Then it gets louder until the sky fills with the pounding of helicopter rotors. Dark shapes begin coming over the tree line, one after another, moving toward the glowing object until it's surrounded by military helicopters, then disappears into the darkness. Then the lights are gone, and the road falls quiet again. But before the night is over, something changes. Their skin begins to burn, blisters start forming, and in the days that follow, Betty Cash loses large amounts of her hair. What you just heard describes an encounter reported on a rural road outside Dayton, Texas, on the night of December 29, 1980. The witnesses were Betty Cash, Vickie Landrum, and Vickie's 7-year-old grandson Colby. All three described the same event: a large glowing object hovering above the road, while a formation of military helicopters surrounded it as it moved away into the night. But the encounter didn't end when the lights disappeared. Within hours, the witnesses began suffering severe burns and blistering. Betty Cash soon began losing large amounts of her hair, and the strange events on that road outside Dayton would eventually lead to one of the most controversial UFO cases ever reported in the United States. I'm your host, Robert Barber. In December of 1980, 3 witnesses driving along a quiet road outside Dayton, Texas, reported an encounter with a strange craft surrounded by military helicopters. Within hours, all 3 began suffering severe burns and blistering. Their injuries would lead to a lawsuit against the United States government and turn the incident into one of the most controversial UFO encounters ever reported in the United States. This is the story of the Cash-Landrum incident. Let's get into it. On the evening of December 29, 1980, Betty Cash was driving along a rural stretch of road through the pine forests of East Texas. In the passenger seat sat Vickie Landrum, a restaurant owner from Dayton, Texas, and in the back seat was Vickie's 7-year-old grandson, Colby Landrum. The 3 of them had spent the evening out together in New Caney, a small community northeast of Houston. Later that evening, sometime after 9 p.m., they started the drive home along Farm to Market Road 1485. FM 1485 runs through a rural stretch of East Texas, and in 1980 much of that area was still heavily wooded with long sections of road and very little traffic at night. Betty knew the route well because she had driven it many times before. Inside the car, the mood was relaxed. They talked about the evening and the drive ahead while Colby watched the road from the back seat. After several miles, Betty noticed something unusual ahead of them. A bright light was visible in the distance, hovering somewhere above the road and the tree line. Betty slowed the car. But as the car continued forward, the light didn't pass overhead or drift across the sky. It stayed fixed in the same position. The closer they got, the clearer it became that the light wasn't floating by itself. It appeared to be attached to something much larger. As Betty drove closer, the outline of an object slowly began to form around the light. The object appeared large and angular, suspended low above the roadway ahead of them, and its glow illuminated the pavement and the nearby trees. Betty eased the car forward, trying to understand what she was looking at. The object wasn't moving like an airplane would. It wasn't traveling across the sky or gaining altitude. Instead, it appeared to be hovering directly above the road. Colby watched from the back seat while Vickie stared through the windshield. As they moved closer, the shape became clearer. Both women later described the object as diamond-shaped, almost like two cones joined together at their bases, with a harsh orange-white light pouring from its underside. Betty later estimated that the object appeared to be about the size of a water tower. The glow coming from it was powerful enough to brighten the entire stretch of road. As they approached, the three of them began to notice something else. The temperature inside the car was rising. At first, the warmth was subtle, but within moments, the heat became more intense. The air inside the vehicle began to feel hot and heavy, as if they were sitting close to a powerful source of heat. Vickie Landrum began to pray quietly in the passenger seat. She had grown up deeply religious, and in later interviews, she said the sight frightened her in a way she couldn't explain. The object remained suspended above the road directly in front of them. Betty slowed the car until it came to a stop. The road ahead was empty, and the glowing object appeared to be sitting directly in their path. The light pouring from it filled the interior of the vehicle. Betty raised a hand toward the dashboard to shield her eyes from the glare, while the heat inside the car continued to build. Then, it changed. As they sat there watching the object hovering above the road, something about it changed. Flames suddenly burst downward from the underside of the craft, blasting toward the pavement in short, violent bursts that lit the road with an intense glow before fading again. Betty Cash later said it felt like they were sitting next to a giant furnace. The dashboard and interior surfaces of the vehicle started to feel hot to the touch, and the heat inside the car kept building while the object remained suspended above the roadway. Vickie Landrum grew increasingly frightened while she continued praying in the passenger seat. She urged Betty not to get out of the car, but Betty wanted to get a better look at what was hovering above the road. She opened the driver's door and stepped outside onto the pavement, and the heat hit her immediately. Later, she said the air itself felt hot enough to burn. She raised her arm to shield her face and looked up at the object above her. From outside the car, the craft appeared even larger than it had through the windshield. Flames continued erupting from its underside in brief bursts that pushed downward toward the road. Within seconds, Betty felt her skin begin to burn, so she turned and hurried back toward the car. When she reached the door and grabbed the handle, the metal was so hot that it burned her hand. She pulled the door open and climbed back into the driver's seat. The three of them sat there staring through the windshield at the glowing craft, and as they watched, a new sound began rising in the distance. At first it was faint and it came from somewhere beyond the trees, but the sound kept growing louder until it became clear they were hearing helicopter rotor blades. Lights soon appeared in the sky above the glowing object. One helicopter moved into view above the tree line, its rotor blades visible against the light pouring from the craft, and within moments, several more aircraft followed. Later, the witnesses said there may have been as many as 20 helicopters in the air. The aircraft looked like large military helicopters flying in formation around the object, and some observers later suggested they resembled CH-47 Chinook helicopters, which are recognizable for their twin rotors. Some of the helicopters approached from behind the craft while others circled above and to the sides. Their navigation lights blinked in the darkness as the rotor blades beat loudly through the night air. For several minutes, the three of them sat inside the car, watching the sky fill with helicopters surrounding the glowing craft while flames continued bursting from its underside. Then the object began to move. It rose slowly at first, lifting higher above the road while the helicopters maintained their formation around it. As the craft gained altitude, it drifted away toward the south, the bursts of flame beneath it continuing to flash while the aircraft followed alongside. Gradually, the formation moved farther away into the distance until the light began to fade and the sound of engines slowly disappeared. Within minutes, the sky returned to darkness, and the road ahead of them was empty again. Betty remained in her seat, gripping the steering wheel while the heat inside the car slowly began to fade. Her hands were shaking as she sat there for a moment trying to process what they had just seen. After a few seconds, she started the engine and continued driving down the road. At that point, none of them realized the encounter had already begun to affect them physically, because before they reached home that night, the first symptoms were already starting to appear. As they continued driving down the dark stretch of road, the sky above them had already returned to darkness. Whatever the glowing craft had been was now far off in the distance, along with the helicopters that had surrounded it. For several minutes, the car remained quiet as they drove. Not long after leaving the area, Betty began to feel sick. It started with nausea while she continued driving along the rural road toward Dayton, where she planned to drop Vickie and Colby off before heading to her own home in nearby Huffman. The nausea didn't fade as they continued driving. Instead, Betty developed a headache and her skin began to feel irritated, especially on her face and scalp where she'd been exposed to the heat when she stepped outside the car. Vickie Landrum soon began feeling ill as well. She complained that her skin felt like it was burning and that her eyes hurt, and Colby, sitting in the back seat, later said he also began to feel dizzy during the drive. They had only been near the object for a short time, but the physical symptoms were already beginning to appear as they continued down the road. When they reached Dayton, Betty pulled into the driveway and dropped Vickie and Colby off at their home. Both of them still felt unwell, but Betty insisted she would be all right and continued driving toward her own house. The nausea followed her during the entire drive home, and later that night the symptoms became worse. Betty began vomiting repeatedly and developed a severe headache along with a burning sensation across her skin. Her eyes became irritated and sensitive to light, and she began feeling extremely weak. When she looked in the mirror the following morning, she saw large blisters forming across parts of her face and neck. Over the next several days, her condition continued to deteriorate as her scalp became extremely sensitive and her hair began falling out in clumps. Painful fluid-filled blisters spread across sections of her skin, and the burns on her hand from the hot car door handle worsened. The symptoms eventually became severe enough that she had to be hospitalized. Vickie Landrum and her grandson Colby experienced their own health problems following the encounter as well. They reported nausea, headaches, and skin irritation in the hours after returning home. Betty had been exposed to the heat the longest when she stepped outside the car, and the most severe injuries appeared in her case. Within days of the encounter, she was in the hospital with symptoms doctors struggled to fully explain. Betty Cash remained in the hospital for several days while doctors tried to understand the injuries she had developed after the encounter. And for Betty, whatever happened that night didn't end on that road. Medical records documented severe skin damage, including burns and large fluid-filled blisters across parts of her body. The blisters appeared on her face, neck, and scalp, and the pain and irritation she described were consistent with significant thermal injury. Doctors also observed additional symptoms that were harder to explain. Betty continued experiencing nausea, weakness, headaches, and sensitivity to light. Her scalp remained extremely tender, and she began losing large amounts of hair in the days after the encounter. Some physicians noted that the combination of symptoms resembled patterns sometimes associated with radiation exposure, although no confirmed radiation source was ever identified. The effects were not limited to the first few days after the encounter. Betty later reported that the recovery process lasted for months and that she continued experiencing weakness, headaches, and skin problems long after the hospital. Vickie Landrum and her grandson Colby also reported health problems following the event, though their symptoms were less severe. Both experienced nausea, headaches, and skin irritation in the hours after returning home, and Vickie later sought medical treatment for problems she believed were connected to what they had witnessed that night. At that point, this should have ended as a strange encounter on a rural road, but it didn't. Because the question wasn't just what they saw, it was who else was there that night. As news of the encounter spread beyond the immediate area, researchers and investigators began taking interest in the case. The combination of close-range sighting, multiple witnesses, and documented medical injuries made the incident difficult to dismiss. Investigators focused particular attention on the helicopters that Betty Cash and Vickie Landrum consistently reported seeing during the encounter. According to their accounts, numerous military-style helicopters surrounded the glowing craft and appeared to maintain formation around it while it hovered above the road. Investigators focused particular attention on the helicopters that Betty Cash and Vickie Landrum consistently reported seeing during the encounter. According to their accounts, numerous military-style helicopters surrounded the glowing craft and appeared to maintain formation around it while it hovered above the road. Both witnesses described the aircraft as large helicopters with two rotors, one mounted at the front and another at the rear of the fuselage. That configuration closely matches the design of the CH-47 Chinook helicopters, a heavy-lift aircraft used by the United States Army. Because helicopters like that operate from nearby military installations, the witnesses believe the aircraft they saw were connected to some kind of government operation. That belief eventually led Betty Cash and Vickie Landrum to take legal action against the United States government. In 1982, they filed a lawsuit under the Federal Tort Claims Act, which allows citizens to seek damage from the federal government for injuries caused by federal employees or government equipment. During the investigation that followed, attorneys attempted to determine whether any military helicopters had been operating in the area on the night of December 29, 1980. Military officials acknowledged that CH-47 Chinook helicopters were used by the U.S. Army and were capable of operating in the region. However, investigators were unable to confirm that any aircraft from nearby military bases had been flying in the area at the time of the encounter. Because the plaintiffs could not prove that the helicopters described by the witnesses belonged to the United States military, the case was ultimately dismissed by a federal court in 1986. The decision meant that Betty Cash and Vickie Landrum received no compensation for the injuries they believed were connected to the encounter. Even after the case ended, the story didn't disappear. The witnesses continued standing by their account of what they had seen that night, and the CH-Landrum incident remained a subject of debate among investigators and researchers who tried to understand what might have happened on that quiet Texas road. In the years that followed, Betty Cash continued to report health problems she believed were connected to the encounter, while the CH-Landrum incident became one of the most widely discussed UFO cases in the United States. And decades later, the central questions surrounding the case still remain unanswered. The CH-Landrum incident stands out among UFO cases because several parts of the story are documented while others remain unexplained. The basic timeline of events is not in dispute. On the night of December 29, 1980, Betty Cash, Vickie Landrum, and Colby Landrum reported seeing a glowing object hovering above Farm to Market Road 1485 in East Texas. Their descriptions of the object stayed consistent over time, and all three witnesses reported the same sequence of events: a large diamond-shaped craft, intense heat, and numerous helicopters surrounding the object before it moved away. The medical issues that followed are also documented. Betty Cash sought medical treatment soon after the encounter, and doctors recorded burns, blistering, nausea, weakness, and hair loss. While the exact cause of those injuries was never determined, the fact that she was hospitalized and treated by physicians is part of the documented record of the case. Another important part of the case involves the helicopters the witnesses reported seeing that night. Both Betty Cash and Vickie Landrum consistently described multiple helicopters surrounding the glowing craft. Their descriptions of the aircraft as large helicopters with two rotors matches the design of the CH-47 Chinook helicopters, which are used by the United States Army. That detail became central to the lawsuit filed against the federal government. If the helicopters were military aircraft, then the witnesses believe the government might have been involved in whatever operation had taken place above the road that night. The investigation that followed the lawsuit did not produce evidence linking the helicopters to the United States military. Officials acknowledged that Chinook helicopters were used by the Army and were capable of operating in the region. However, investigators were unable to confirm that any military aircraft had been flying in the area that night. Investigators also contacted nearby military installations, including Fort Hood and Ellington Field, to determine whether any helicopters had been operating in the region. Those inquiries did not produce records of flight activity matching the sightings described by the witnesses. Because the plaintiffs could not prove that the helicopters belonged to the federal government, the court dismissed the case. As a result, several important questions remain unresolved. If the witnesses accurately described what they saw, then the helicopters appeared to be surrounding or escorting the glowing craft as it moved through the sky. That raises the possibility that the aircraft were either responding to the object or operating alongside it. The source of the intense heat also remains unclear, even though the witnesses reported that the heat from the object was strong enough to warm the interior of the car and burn the metal door handle when Betty tried to get back inside. The cause of Betty Cash's injuries remains uncertain as well. Doctors treated the burns and other symptoms she experienced, but investigators were never able to identify an aircraft, technology, or environmental factor operating in the area that could account for those effects. When those pieces are considered together, the case contains both documented events and unanswered questions. The witnesses maintained their accounts for years. The medical records confirm that Betty Cash was treated for significant injuries after the encounter, and no official explanation was ever provided for the craft, the helicopters, or the physical effects reported that night. Those unanswered elements are what continue to make the Cash Landrum incident one of the most unusual cases in modern UFO history. When I think about the Cash Landrum case, I keep coming back to the same point, and it has nothing to do with whether the object was bright or strange or difficult to identify. Cases like that exist all over the place. What makes this one different is the possibility created by the helicopters. If the witnesses describe that part accurately, and if those really were military aircraft, then we have to stop and think about what that actually means. Because at that point, the story is no longer just about three people seeing something they couldn't explain over a dark road in Texas. It becomes a story about military aircraft operating around an object that was either ours or it wasn't. And that's where the case becomes unsettling in a much bigger way. Because if that object was some kind of military test aircraft, then that means the public was never told what was being flown, what it could do, or what kind of effects it was capable of having on people on the ground. That alone would be disturbing enough. But if it wasn't a military aircraft, then the implication is even bigger than that. Because if the object was not from here, and the military helicopters were there with it, then that means the question of whether we're alone in the universe is not really a question anymore. It means someone already knows the answer. It means that what most people still treat as speculation would, in that case, be established reality to at least some part of the government or military. And if that's true, then the most important question created by this case is not just what Betty Cash, Vickie Landrum, and Colby Landrum saw that night. The biggest question is why. If something like that was known, nothing was ever said publicly in a clear and honest way. Because this case was not buried in folklore or lost in some distant century. This happened in 1980. There were witnesses. There were documented injuries. There was a federal lawsuit. There were investigators. There were records. And even with all of that, the public was left with no explanation that answered the central question. So when I think about this story, the part that stays with me is not just the image of that object over the road. It's the possibility that if this account is true, then the people most capable of understanding what happened may have understood far more than they ever admitted. And if that's the case, then the silence surrounding incidents like this may be the most disturbing part of the whole story. So when I think about this story, the question it leaves me with is not whether something unexplained was in the sky over that road. It's whether the government already knew exactly what it was. And if they did, why the rest of us were never told. This has been State of the Unknown. The Cash Landrum incident remains one of the most unusual UFO encounters reported in the United States. 3 witnesses described a glowing craft hovering over a rural Texas road, intense heat pouring from beneath it, and multiple twin-rotor helicopters surrounding the object before it moved away into the night. One of those witnesses ended up in the hospital with documented injuries. The case eventually made its way into federal court. But even after an investigation and a lawsuit against the United States government, no official explanation was ever given for the craft or the helicopters that appeared alongside it. If you enjoy stories like these, leaving a rating or review in your podcast app really does help more people find the show. On Spotify, it's just a tap of the stars. And if you're listening on an iPhone, you can leave a short written review right in your Apple Podcasts app. I read them, and I really do appreciate everyone. And if you want to make sure you hear the next story when it drops, just hit follow in your podcast app so the next episode shows up automatically. Until next time, stay curious. Because sometimes the strangest stories are the ones where the witnesses agree the evidence exists, but no one ever explains what was in the sky that night.